So, yes, we're moving now to security, nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And Senator Ludlam has some questions.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Welcome back, Ms Miller and Dr Floyd. I'm glad we finally got to you. Could you just provide us with a quick update on the status of negotiations on uranium sales to India?
Dr Robert Floyd, Director General of the Australian Safeguards Non-Proliferation Office. Thank you, Senator, for your question. The update is that we have had one meeting with the negotiating team from India. That was held in the third week of March this year in New Delhi, and that will be followed up by a second session of negotiations which will be held in the last week of July, and that will be here in Canberra. The first session was basically exploratory, looking at the range of issues that both sides were mindful of, that the others then should know about, and it wasn't going beyond just the airing of broad issues.
Okay. Could you just describe for us in general terms what the broad issues are, of how the different sort of categories or baskets of negotiations will fall out?
Because it's the basis of a treaty negotiation between two countries, then I can't go into too much details because of the sensitivity of those negotiations.
Keep it high level if you like.
But it's reasonable, for me to say that we have the policy that we have in Australia for uranium exports, and when we meet with India, then we have uniqueness from the Australian side and they've got uniqueness from the Indian side, and so we're wishing to explore and understand each other's positions in those ways. So really it's looking at how those things come together, but it's the normal elements, as you're familiar with your time on J, Scott, the normal elements of an agreement that we need to go through, whether it's about IAEA safeguards measures that need to be in place, details of security or cessation, or all of the standard elements that Senator, you're well familiar with in other agreements.
Is reactor safety one of the elements of the negotiation? Was that canvassed?
I can't recall whether that was specifically mentioned at this first meeting, but that does fit within the broad range of issues that will be discussed, in terms of safety. That's correct.
Okay. As distinct from proliferation issues, which is not the framework under which these negotiations are occurring, but normally would be.
The proliferation issues are clearly the major part, of these agreements, but there's other allied issues that are folded in often to do with security, which may not be proliferation specifically, and then safety also.
Okay. So a second session in the last week of July. How many sessions after that do you anticipate will be required before there's some agreement that would then come to the Treaties Committee?
Senator, it would be cheeky of me to say I'll take that on notice, but I really have no idea. It really just depends on how the negotiations develop, so I really couldn't answer that, Senator.
All right. No way of guessing how long it's going to take to conclude?
No, Senator.
Okay. Do these things have to go into abeyance when the government goes into caretaker mode in August?
When we go into caretaker mode, there can never be any entering into commitments in that period. So that clearly couldn't happen. There could be continued discussions, but it will all depend on what happens on the fourth week of July as to what the next steps would be. So, Senator, exactly what happens next will not be clear to us until the fourth week of July.
Okay. Are representatives of mining interests present in these negotiations? Were they in Delhi?
No, Senator. It's negotiations between the two governments that take place.
Okay. Is there any update on negotiations on an agreement with China, or is that stalled pending further decisions by BHP?
If you're referring to the concept that was floated some time ago about copper ore concentrates with
sales
uranium
agreement with China
involved,
that would have required probably an amendment to our bilateral safeguards agreement.
That's correct. That is the situation. No, there is no progress on that, Senator. As you're aware, the Olympic Dam expansion project has been held in abeyance by BHP Billiton, and we have no clarity at all as to whether or when that would move forward, and also any decisions BHP Billiton might make about how they would wish to process that ore.
Yeah.
So until there's more clarity, we wouldn't be moving ahead on this issue.
Yeah, fine. Okay. Dr. Floyd, I believe you attended the Oslo conference recently at the invitation of the Norwegian government on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And Ms. Miller, did you attend that one as well?
No, Senator, I did not.
Okay. But Dr. Floyd, you were in attendance at that.
That's correct, Senator.
I understand there is now a proposal for Mexico to hold the next conference in the series. Will Australia participate in that one?
Caroline Miller, First Assistant Secretary, International Security Division. Senator, we haven't yet looked at the question of participation in that conference.
Okay. If negotiations for a nuclear weapons ban begin soon after the Mexico conference, which seems entirely possible, would Australia participate in those negotiations?
Senator, that would be a matter for ministers.
Okay. Did any Australian representative make any presentation or representation of any kind at all at the Oslo conference at which 50 other governments spoke?
No, we didn't take the floor at the meeting. The meeting was convened as an opportunity for greater understanding to be developed on this issue, and it was certainly very helpful in that regard, both formally then informally with discussions with other participants at the conference.
Okay, but 50 other governments thought it was worth putting a view. For what reason was Australia entirely mute as far as the official proceedings of the conference went?
Yeah, as I said, the prime purpose of the meeting was for understanding of these issues, and that was certainly our objective, was to gain understanding. That was our objective, and I think it was achieved, Senator.
Okay. If Australia does choose to send a representative to the Mexico conference, will we make any contribution to that one?
I think that is a hypothetical question because it is a significant step forward from this point in time. We'd need to consider it at a time when that's on the table, Senator.
Okay. Now, on the 26th of September, there's a high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament at the United Nations. So that's only a fortnight after the federal election. So without knowing who the Prime Minister is even going to be at the time of that conference, what kind of preparation are we making? Are we planning on attending at some level that conference?
Senator, I'm not aware of the conference to which you refer.
Okay. It's being spoken of as the high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament at the UN on 26 September. Not something familiar? I'll see if I can get a little bit more info for you. What proposals is Australia taking to the UN open-ended working group that was set up last year to develop proposals, I'll quote, to develop proposals to take forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations for the achievement and maintenance of a world without nuclear weapons? I understand Australia's made a few off-the-cuff comments responding to presentations, but we haven't made any formal statements on that yet.
Look, Senator, I'd have to take that on notice to get details for you. I mean, the issues covered in that open-ended working group are the ones that we've been trying to get progress on in a range of UN forums over many years. So there'll be nothing particularly new in our positions. It'll just be another forum which to try and get some movement, given particularly the paralysis in the Conference on Disarmament.
Yeah. So Australia still supports the eventual achievement and maintenance of a world without nuclear weapons, I take it. There's been no substantive shift in policy.
No, there has not.
No, there hasn't. So how do we reconcile that with the 2013 Defence White Paper, which rather embarrassingly continues Australia's support of the use of nuclear weapons in our security policy?
Senator, as the White Paper states, as long as nuclear weapons continue to exist, the government will rely on the nuclear forces of the United States to deter nuclear attack on Australia. Of course, our goal is a world without nuclear weapons, but we're not at that point.
But we will never be at that point while we continue to support deterrence theory and the existence of or the benefits of Australia remaining under a nuclear weapons umbrella. So it's rather contradictory, is it not?
But the logic of that position, Senator, would be that Australia withdraw from the US treaty relationship.
The treaty relationship is bounded on much deeper foundations than simply the use of nuclear weapons, surely.
Yes, it is, but still the deterrent impact to a nuclear attack on Australia implied in that treaty is real. Therefore, to do what you just advocated a moment ago would mean Australia abrogating the ANZUS treaty.
Why would we not simply renegotiate the treaty rather than unilaterally abrogating it? It's up to it. Does Australia still set its own foreign policy, Minister Carr?
Australian people support, made this very clear over very many years, still support the security relationship with the United States.
Yeah, but they
and
don't
implied in that is that America as a nuclear power represents protection for Australia against a nuclear attack.
By the threat of mass incineration of whoever has attacked Australia. So we're still playing with the 1950s doctrine of mutually assured destruction.
We are strongly committed to a world without nuclear weapons, as we on this side of politics have been since the initiative of the Canberra Commission.
Which was an extremely welcome initiative.
And we remain committed to that.
While still supporting the existence of nuclear weapons in Australian security policy. So perhaps I'm the only one in the room who sees that the essential contradiction in that.
Well, I'm just asking you to follow through on branding it a contradiction and say that you favour a policy of armed neutrality for Australia, because that's the alternative to the American alliance. If you say Australia should abrogate the defence relationship we have with America because that implies nuclear protection for Australia in the event of a nuclear threat to Australia, then the logic of that is that Australia must look after its own defences. And that means armed neutrality, unless you're arguing for a disarmed and neutral Australia.
Minister, I'm not sure whether you're deliberately or accidentally misconstruing my point. Are you aware that all five of the legally recognised nuclear states, as defined in the NPT, plus the others that we know of, are all actively renewing and upgrading their nuclear weapons arsenals, which you would have to view as being in violation of Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is one of the three pillars, so to speak, of the treaty?
Yes, it is. The treaty, agreed on in the late 60s and ratified in the years immediately after, carries an obligation on nuclear powers to commit to disarmament.
So how do we square that?
That hasn't been fulfilled, and that was why a Labor government set up the Canberra Commission to place on the international agenda the challenge of fulfilling what was specified as a goal of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Our ally, the United States, which continues not only to deploy nuclear weapons but to modernise and upgrade them, would appear to be, along with all the other nuclear weapon states, in direct violation of Article 6. So what's Australia doing about that?
Well, Australia is an advocate of nuclear disarmament. We want a world without nuclear weapons.
But we just wrote it back into our 2013 defence policy.
Australia, while nuclear weapons exist, has got to accommodate the possibility that we might one day be threatened by a state that has nuclear weapons. If you if you want to abrogate the possibility of us falling under the American nuclear umbrella in respect of a nuclear attack, not a conventional attack on Australia, you must follow through on that logic. And that logic mandates abandoning the ANZUS Treaty, withdrawing from the ANZUS Treaty.
Or renegotiating it.
All right, renegotiating it to say that we would not seek the deterrent force of America's nuclear capacity in the event of a nuclear attack on Australia.
You've just told, the committee, and I welcome your comment.
Put that to the Australian people.
Oh, you've just told the committee, and I welcome the comment, that we don't support the continued existence of nuclear weapons, that we've been working for decades in the ALP on 2 instances with the Canberra Commission and the more recent Prime Minister Rudd's more recent initiative with the Japanese government on the Joint Commission on Nuclear Weapons, working towards disarmament, and yet you're not prepared to actually embed that in Australia's
While
security
disarmament hasn't taken place,
the
defence of this continent has got to be taken care of, and hence my remarks. It is not remotely contradictory to say that we want a world without nuclear weapons, while the world has nuclear weapons. Before a negotiated destruction of nuclear weapons has occurred, we still must attend to the future of this country. Now, when I say this to you, I'm speaking to a representative, I say this politely, of a party that hasn't a defence policy. You have not got a defence policy.
We do. I'll download it for you. I'll hand it over.
Okay. But you're the first, the comments you made a moment ago, the first time I've heard a Green Party senator say that we would withdraw or renegotiate, which is the same thing, which is the same thing.
No, it's not.
From the ANZUS Treaty.
Renegotiating the ANZUS Treaty to take Australia out from under the nuclear weapons umbrella, which you've just acknowledged you would like to see dissolved.
How would you word that? This is an interesting exchange, a very important one, because I've never had a Green Party senator spell this out. How would you word that modification of the ANZUS Treaty?
Maybe, Minister, you'll get to ask questions after the election from the other side of the bench, but right at the moment...
I want to ask them of a Green Party senator.
When I get to be the Minister, Senator Carr, then you get to address the questions to me. In the meantime, I'm trying to understand...
It's a Socratic dialogue. We advance the proposition by...
Well, I thought it was an estimates committee.
Questioning.
I thought it was an estimates committee hearing myself.
Senator Kroger understands that.
Minister, if...
Senator Kroger's giving me an encouraging look.
I know Senator Carr is wearing all of us down, including myself. I'm trying to understand how you can square wanting the elimination of these weapons while writing it into security policy.
Chair, I think I've answered that. I've said now 3 times that while we want a world without nuclear weapons, we can only get there by negotiation. And before we have the nuclear weapon powers abrogate and abolish their nuclear weapons, we must tend to the defence of this continent, including the possibility that we could be threatened by a nuclear power.
All right, my final question, which state presently threatens Australia with a nuclear strike?
I'm not going to address that question.
Why is that?
There's no imminent threat to Australia. I refer you to the Defence White Paper and the White Paper on Australian security.